Our story tonight is about the ghosts of the night sky, about women whose names the enemy spoke with superstitious fear, about the night witches. This isn't just a story about war. It's a story about how young girls, barely more than teenagers, became one of the most terrifying and effective weapons of the Soviet Union. But before we dive into this dark tale, answer one question in the comments below. What do you think is more terrifying? The thunder of 1,000 cannons, or the dead silence before an inevitable attack? The world trembled in the summer of 1941. The steel juggernaut of the Wehrmacht rolled relentlessly eastward, crushing defenses and grinding lives into dust. It seemed that nothing could stop it. Long lines of volunteers filled the recruitment offices, men, old veterans, even boys barely old enough to hold a rifle. And among them stood thousands of women, pleading to be sent to the front. But their requests were met with smirks and rejections. War is not a woman's business, they were told. Their place was in the factory, in the hospital, in the rear. Yet one woman refused to accept that. Her name was Marina Raskova, a legendary aviator, record breaker, and national hero known across the Soviet Union. Using her fame and courage, she reached the highest authority, Joseph Stalin himself, and achieved the impossible: the creation of 3 all-female aviation regiments. One of them would become a legend and a living nightmare for an entire army. But what if I told you that the most fearsome weapon these women wielded was made of plywood and fabric? And that their greatest ally was the night itself, an Namstadams, the flying graves. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment was given an aircraft that made most pilots smirk with disbelief, the Po-2 or U-2, a training biplane born in the 1920s. A wooden frame covered with percale, a thin, linen-like fabric, an open cockpit where wind and frost tore at the pilots' faces. No armor, no parachutes at first. They left them behind to carry a few extra kilograms of bombs. Its top speed was barely 150 kilometers an hour, slower than many cars of that era. Any German fighter could catch up and shred it to pieces in a single burst. It wasn't an airplane. It was a flying coffin. And yet, that fragile relic became the perfect weapon of night warfare. Why? Because it could fly almost at stalling speed. It could skim so low that radar couldn't see it, glide so slowly it could weave between trees and hills. And just before reaching the target, the pilots did something that froze German blood. They shut off the engine. The plane then drifted through the darkness, silent, except for a faint, whispering rustle that sounded like a witch's broom. The Germans would hear that soft hiss, and then the explosions. That sound was the last thing many of them ever heard. So the nickname was born, Nachthexen, the Night Witches. It was an aircraft that forgave no mistakes. But in the hands of these women, it became a scalpel, cutting through the enemy's nerves in the impenetrable dark. And do you know why the Germans feared them more than fire itself? Because they were untraceable. They appeared from nowhere and vanished into nothing. In a single night, one crew could fly 10, 15, sometimes even 18 missions. Unthinkable numbers, beyond human endurance. They would take off, drop their bombs, return for a few minutes, where mechanics, also young women, rearmed and refueled the planes in freezing mud and howling wind, and then up again into the night. A conveyor of death, working without pause from dusk till dawn. The pilots were between 17 and 26 years old. Yesterday's students, teachers, factory workers. They painted on their bombs for the motherland, and for Stalin. And on their fragile wooden fuselages, they drew flowers. Life was harsh. They slept in short bursts, ate whatever they could find, shivered in unheated dugouts. They lost friends. They saw planes burst into flames like matches when hit by tracer rounds, falling in glowing spirals to the earth below. Each of them knew every takeoff could be her last. And yet, night after night, they rose into the sky again. Are you ready to find out what price these victories demanded? And what personal tragedies hid behind the cold lines of combat reports? Picture this: a deafening silence. The dead of night. Temperature -30. You're sitting in an open cockpit. The wind burns your face to the bone. The instruments flicker dimly in the weak light. Beneath you, enemy territory. Every tiny spark of light below could mean death. A searchlight that might rip you from the darkness, turning you into an easy target. An anti-aircraft gun waiting to hurl a storm of fire into the sky. Your navigator, your friend, sits just ahead of you, giving final instructions. Her life, like yours, depends on the precision of every movement. There it is, the target, an ammunition depot, a column of tanks, an enemy headquarters. You turn onto your attack course, and then you cut the engine. Suddenly, an overwhelming silence. The only sound, the wind whistling through the tension wires of the wings. The ground is rushing up to meet you. A heartbeat, a blink, drop, a sharp turn, full throttle. The engine roars back to life, deafening, furious. You skim away at treetop height, the branches almost brushing your landing gear. Behind you, searchlights slash the sky. Anti-aircraft shells explode in bursts of fire. But you're already gone, dissolved into the saving darkness. And then, again, and again, every night. It was only one mission, out of tens of thousands. But behind every flight lay a story of fear, courage, and loss. And what I'm about to tell you next rarely found its way into official chronicles. A sky the color of steel. June 22nd, 1941. A day that split time itself in two, before and after. The air, which only yesterday smelled of summer grass and peace, suddenly thickened with smoke and fear. It became heavy, metallic. The sky over the western borders of the Soviet Union turned the color of heated steel. Operation Barbarossa, the largest and bloodiest invasion in human history, had begun. Thousands of tanks tore through the earth. Thousands of Luftwaffe planes rained death from above, wiping out Soviet aircraft right on the runways. Entire armies fell back, were encircled in vast cauldrons, or simply vanished in the chaos of those first weeks. Official radio bulletins sounded dry and emotionless. But behind each phrase, "We left the city," hid thousands of broken lives and shattered destinies. The nation was struck by shock, then confusion, and finally, rage. Recruitment centers across the country flooded with men ready to defend their homeland. But there was another wave, one the system wasn't prepared to face. A wave made up of thousands upon thousands of women. While men were dying in the infernos of encirclement, deep in the rear, another war was unfolding. A quiet war. A women's war for the right to die for their country. They besieged draft offices with desperation that bordered on madness. Young girls, fresh out of school, students, factory workers. Many weren't amateurs. Back in the 30s, the nation had lived under the slogan, "Komsomol Youth, to the skies." Thousands of boys and girls had trained in Oso-Aviakim flight clubs. They knew how to fly, how to parachute, how to navigate. Others had finished courses as medics, radio operators, and signalers. They were trained, motivated, ready. But the stern commissars in their worn uniforms brushed them off. "Go home, daughter. We need soldiers, not you. Your place is in the hospital or at the factory. War is not a woman's business." That phrase fell like a verdict. A brand. It humiliated, it hurt. But worst of all, it denied them the right to share in the nation's fate, its pain, its struggle. They wrote letters to newspapers, to the Supreme Soviet, even to Stalin himself. They asked, they demanded, they begged. The system was deaf to their pleas. But what if there was someone the system couldn't ignore? Someone whose very name symbolized the Soviet sky. Her name was Marina Mikhailovna Raskova. It echoed across the country. A major of state security, a navigator pilot, one of the first women ever awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Her portraits filled newspapers. Songs were written about her. In 1938, together with her crew, she made a record-breaking non-stop flight. Moscow to the Far East, aboard the An-T-37 Rodina. During that flight, the plane iced over and began to lose altitude. To save the aircraft and her comrades, Raskova, the navigator, parachuted into the endless, frozen taiga. For 10 days, she survived alone, without food, almost without water, until she stumbled upon civilization. The whole country followed her story, breath held. She was seen not just as a pilot, but as a model Soviet woman, brave, educated, unbreakable. She wasn't merely a celebrity. She had access, direct lines to the highest offices in the Kremlin. And soon, letters from rejected young women began pouring onto her desk. Raskova became their last hope. And she acted. She was a living icon. But even for her, breaking through the wall of old prejudices and male arrogance was nearly impossible. Do you know what it took for her to be heard? She used every bit of her authority, every connection. She wrote reports, knocked on doors at the People's Commissariat of Defense. She was received with respect and polite refusal. Generals, veterans of Spain and Caucasus, couldn't imagine a woman at the controls of a fighter or a bomber. It's impossible. They won't handle the physical strain. It'll cause discipline problems. We have no facilities for them, no uniforms, no barracks. The arguments were as solid as tank armor. But Raskova possessed something even stronger, persistence. Realizing she wouldn't win over the generals, she took the ultimate gamble. Using her influence and personal connections, she secured a private audience with Joseph Stalin himself. No one knows exactly what was said in that conversation. But clearly, Raskova found the right words. She didn't speak about equality. She spoke about resources, untapped in the nation's darkest hour. She spoke about propaganda, the image of young falcons avenging their ravaged homeland. And Stalin listened. On October 8, 1941, an order was signed. Directive number 0099 of the People's Commissar of Defense of the USSR. On the formation of female aviation regiments in the Red Army Air Force. The order was official. The machine was in motion. Across the vast land, from Moscow to the farthest taiga, the call spread. And thousands of girls, yesterday's students and dreamers, left everything behind and went to meet their fate. But what awaited them in the frozen steppes near the city of Engels would surpass even their darkest expectations. The shorn braids. The city of Engels, deep in the Soviet rear, stood on the banks of the great Volga River. Here, at the Military Aviation Pilot School, in late October of 1941, thousands of young women arrived from every corner of the vast Soviet land. Girls from Moscow and Leningrad, from Siberia, from Ukraine. They came packed into freight cars, singing songs to the strum of a guitar, sharing bits of bread and endless dreams. Each believed she would become a fighter ace, the scourge of the Luftwaffe. What greeted them instead was a windswept steppe and the stern, unsmiling faces of commanders hardened by war. The romance ended before it began. Their first stop was the supply depot. There they were issued men's uniforms, several sizes too large, rough tunics, baggy trousers, heavy boots that rubbed their feet raw, and greatcoats so enormous and stiff that the girls seemed to vanish inside them. They looked at one another, trying to find their former selves in this shapeless army of strangers, and they laughed, nervously on the verge of tears. They had come chasing the dream of heroism and found instead the harsh, faceless prose of military life. Then came their first order, one that made many of them cry. All personnel are to have their hair cut short. The command was cold, final, not open for discussion. For many, it was the first true shock, the first offering to the altar of war. Long braids, every girl's pride, were hacked off with dull army scissors, falling to the dirty floor of the barracks. It wasn't simply a matter of hygiene, as they were told. It was a ritual, a farewell to their old lives, to femininity, to individuality. From the mirrors stared back strangers, shorn girls with frightened eyes. Along with their hair, they lost their names, becoming soldiers, cadets, anonymous units in formation. And the formation was merciless. Reveille at 5 a.m. to the icy blast of a bugle. Exercises in the freezing air that stole their breath. Drill practice that pushed them to exhaustion. And above it all stood Marina Raskova, no longer the smiling heroine from the newspapers, but a strict, unyielding commander. She knew they had no time, and that pity was the last thing they needed. They lost their appearance, becoming soldiers. But ahead awaited an even greater loss, the loss of illusions. Because the truth was this: their training program wasn't designed to teach. It was designed to break the weak. Their days were measured not by hours, but by minutes. 3 years of flight school training compressed into 6 months. It wasn't education. It was survival. From dawn till late night. Flights. They trained in impossible conditions. The brutal winter of 41 to 42. Snowstorms burying the airfield. Temperatures dropping to -30. In open cockpits of U-2 trainers, the cold was a physical pain. It crept beneath their helmets, burned their faces, locked their fingers in fur mittens. Many suffered frostbite. And when the day's flying was done, their bodies aching, they trudged into freezing classrooms. There they studied until midnight: aircraft design, navigation, bombing theory, ballistics, Morse code. They slept 4, sometimes 5 hours at best. Some fell asleep right at their desks. Raskova showed no mercy. The smallest mistake in flight, the slightest miscalculation on the ground, meant immediate dismissal. Expulsion was equal to disgrace. Each day thinned the ranks, weeding out those who couldn't endure the infernal pace. Only the strongest remained. And when it seemed the worst was over, came the final blow: the assignment. The day arrived when an order was read aloud before the assembled cadets: the formation of 3 regiments. The 586th Fighter Regiment, equipped with the new Yak-1 fighters. Fast, agile, deadly machines. Every girl dreamed of flying them. The 587th Bomber Regiment, receiving the powerful PE-2 dive bombers, the fearsome Peshkas. Complex to fly, but prestigious and respected. And then, the 588th Night Light Bomber Regiment. When the girls whose names appeared on that list learned what aircraft they'd been assigned, many couldn't hold back their tears. Their plane was the U-2, the same old training biplane. A plywood shelf, a slow sewing machine, a relic. They felt deceived. They had endured the hell of Engels to earn the right to fight as equals, and instead were given a plane that seemed like a cruel joke. Their commander was appointed, Yevdokia Davidovna Bershanskaya, an experienced pilot with 10 years of service. It would be her task to turn these disappointed, wounded young women into one of the most lethal squadrons in aviation history. They were handed the oldest, slowest planes. Their missions would be flown only at night, the kind considered almost suicidal. It seemed they'd been written off before the first battle even began. But what if I told you that this so-called second-rate squadron would become the most effective, the most legendary of them all? That their transformation of weakness into strength is still studied in military academies to this day. The Dance with Death. May 1942. The 588th Regiment arrived at the Southern Front. War greeted them not with marches and glory, but with sticky mud that swallowed the wheels of their planes. The air was different here. It smelled of gunpowder, metal, and fear. At night, the western horizon flickered with distant explosions, and streaks of tracer fire slashed across the sky. This was no longer training. This was war. But the hardest trial at first wasn't combat. It was attitude. When the young women, dressed in their oversized flight suits, lined up by their planes, they felt the eyes on them. The eyes of seasoned soldiers and male pilots from nearby regiments. Eyes full of curiosity, disbelief, condescension, and sometimes open mockery. Behind their backs they whispered, "Dunya's regiment has arrived." The night violets. What are they going to fight on? Those flying shelves? No one believed these night violets, in their plywood contraptions, would last a week in the inferno of frontline skies. But what if I told you that their very first combat mission silenced even the loudest skeptics? The evening before their first operation was thick with tension. You could almost touch it. Regiment Commander Yevdokia Bershanskaya gathered the crews inside a cramped dugout. Her face was calm, almost unreadable. Yet in her eyes burned the weight of responsibility for 120 young lives. She made no grand speeches. Her words were clear and precise. The target, a German division headquarters and a river crossing. She outlined the route, pointed to anti-aircraft positions on the map, explained the procedure. While she spoke, the female mechanics prepared the planes for takeoff. They checked every wire, every bolt. They hung the bombs beneath the wings, 100-kilogram explosives, each heavier than some of the women who carried them. Meanwhile, the pilots and navigators bent silently over their maps, marking their course in pencil. They didn't speak. They were thinking. Someone scribbled a few hurried lines in a letter home. Someone else just stared into the table, trying to stop her knees from trembling. The air itself hummed with tension. Each one of them knew this was not a drill. Down below would not be a training target. It would be an enemy determined to kill them by every means possible. Are you ready to see the war through their eyes? The first plane taxied onto the field after sunset. The roar of the M11 engine shattered the night silence. A short run over the uneven airstrip, and the small biplane lifted into the black void. Then came the second, and the third. In the cockpit, it was cold and utterly dark. The instrument panel glowed faintly, just enough to read the dials. The navigator in the front seat lit her map with a small flashlight, while the pilot behind her peered into the endless darkness ahead. They flew low, hugging the dark patches of land, avoiding roads and villages. And then, they crossed the front line. The world changed in an instant. The quiet sky came alive. Far below, beams of searchlights crawled across the ground, sweeping the heavens. To the sides, bursts of flak blossomed in fiery flowers. Tracer rounds, long dotted lines, climbed lazily upward. All that deadly beauty was meant for them. They were being hunted. And then, the first beam caught them. A blinding white light filled the cockpit. For a moment, they were trapped in a ghostly glow, visible to every gun below. They looked like moths drawn to a flame that promised only death. Every flash of anti-aircraft fire could be the last. But the most terrifying moment was still ahead. The moment when the engine had to be turned off. The pilot threw the plane into a sharp skid, trying to shake off the searchlight's glare. The navigator shouted over the screaming wind, "Course 120, straight ahead." There it was, the target, dark shapes by a bend in the river. "Ready?" The pilot eased back the throttle. The roar faded into a crushing silence. Only the whisper of wind through the wings remained. That same eerie rustle the Germans would soon learn to dread. The plane glided downward, a silent predator in the night. Seconds stretched into eternity. Below, tiny figures scattered in panic. Too late. Drop! The pilot pulled the release lever. A jolt, and the bombs fell toward the target. Then, full throttle. The engine came roaring back to life. The plane plunged toward the ground, racing for the darkness below, escaping the deadly light. And behind them, where the enemy headquarters once stood, two blinding explosions tore the night apart. They flew home, skimming the treetops, the adrenaline fading into ringing silence and bone-deep exhaustion. Their first combat mission was over. They had survived. That night, they returned without losses. They had proven they could fight. But it was only the first drop in a sea of blood and fire. What began as a single successful raid would soon turn into a relentless, night-after-night conveyor of death. And the precision with which they honed their deadly art would make the Germans believe they were facing something supernatural. The Conveyor of Death. Their first victory brought no rest. On the contrary, it brought more work. The skepticism at headquarters was replaced by cold, practical calculation. Command quickly realized what a unique weapon they had stumbled upon. The cheap, slow, nearly invisible PO-2, flown by fearless pilots, could deliver pinpoint, exhausting strikes where heavy bombers failed. And so the missions poured in. Destroy the headquarters. Take out the crossing. Bomb the fuel depot. Keep the enemy reserves awake. That last order became their signature. The regiment's life fell into a new, merciless rhythm. Sleep, in brief snatches during the day, inside stifling dugouts. Night, that was work. The airfield turned into an infernal conveyor belt. From the darkness, the outline of a Po-2 would emerge, rolling to a stop at the refueling point. The engine never shut down. Ground crews, all women, ran toward it. One carried buckets of fuel, another an oil can. The armorers struggled under the weight of new bombs, hanging them beneath the wings. Meanwhile, the pilot and navigator received their next mission, gulped down a mug of hot tea. If they were lucky, 5 minutes, 7, 10 at most. Then the roar of the engine again, another takeoff, another dive into the black. And so it went, all night long, crew after crew. The planes barely had time to cool. 8, 10, sometimes 12 sorties per crew per night. The human body wasn't built for such strain. But they endured. Night after night, they became extensions of their fragile wooden machines. But discipline and endurance alone weren't enough to survive. So they began to invent. The Germans soon recovered from the initial shock. They understood now who they were up against. Around key positions, the skies filled with patrols of Messerschmitt night fighters. The ground bristled with searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries. The heavens became a lethal trap. Flying solo turned into suicide. So the witches devised a tactic that would later be known as the Devil's Carousel. They flew in groups of 2 or 3. 2 aircraft acted as decoys, entering the anti-aircraft zone from different sides. Instantly, every searchlight swung toward them, every gun opened fire, and the deadly dance began. 2 tiny biplanes twisted and darted through the blinding beams, dodging the bursts, drawing every eye to themselves. While all attention was fixed on them, the third plane, the killer plane, slipped in from another direction. In total darkness, with its engine barely above idle, it dropped its bombs with perfect precision and vanished unseen. It was a dance with death, demanding nerves of steel and absolute trust in one another. But while the pilots waged their terrifying ballet in the skies, another, quieter battle raged on the ground. Do you know that the fate of every witch depended on the frostbitten hands of other women? They were called the ground crew, mechanics, engineers, armorers, instrument specialists. Every one of them a woman. Their war had no trace of romance. It smelled of gasoline, oil, and frozen metal. There were no warm hangars. They worked in the open, in any weather, under freezing rain, in cutting wind, knee-deep in mud. They patched bullet holes in the percale skin of the wings, using glue and cloth patches like bandages. They overhauled engines by hand. They hung 100-kilogram bombs using only muscle and simple levers. After every sortie, they inspected the planes for damage, searching for tears, cracks, bullet holes. Their hands were raw, blistered, soaked in oil and fuel. But on their work depended the lives of their sisters in the air. A single missed bullet hole in a spar, a loose cable, and a plane would never return. They slept even less than the pilots. Their heroism never made the headlines. No medals for every patched-up aircraft. But their devotion built the foundation of the legend that was about to rise. And soon, that legend would receive a name given by the enemy. German soldiers on the front lines began to lose their sanity. Picture it. Night, silence. You're trying to sleep in a cold trench, and suddenly, an explosion. Then another, and another. No warning, no rumble of heavy bombers, no sirens. Only a strange, faint rustle in the sky, like the whisper of a broom. And then, death. This relentless harassment shattered nerves. The Germans couldn't rest, couldn't sleep. They lived in constant tension, waiting for an invisible strike from above. In the trenches, the nickname was born, Nachthexen, the night witches. It was born from fear, from helplessness, from superstitious terror before an unseen, unstoppable enemy. Rumors spread across the front. They said Stalin had filled the regiment with female criminals from the Gulag, that they were injected with potions to see in the dark like cats, that they performed pagan rituals before every flight. Anything seemed more believable than the truth, that ordinary girls, flying training biplanes, were driving the Wehrmacht mad. Thus, fear became legend. The name Night Witches stuck. The German command declared open season on the regiment, promising an Iron Cross to any pilot who shot down a witch. The sky grew even more dangerous, and one night, luck finally turned its back on them. The broken flight, they had grown used to being the hunters. But now, they had become the prey. The fame of the night witches had spread across both sides of the front. In Soviet reports, they were hailed as guardians and eagles. But in German orders, The words were much simpler. Destroy them, at any cost. To hunt down the ghostly Night Regiment, the Luftwaffe dispatched its best, the elite Nachtjäger, the Night Hunters, aces who already had dozens of British and American bombers to their names. Their Messerschmitt Bf-110s, equipped with radar and heavy cannons, were true flying predators. And now they were on the prowl. The girls knew it. They saw unfamiliar shapes crossing the sky. They heard German voices on intercepted radio transmissions. The sky they had come to think of as their own was no longer safe. Up there now flew an enemy who was faster, stronger, and far better armed. And one night in August 1942, that enemy struck. It was a routine mission, one of many. The target, a cluster of German vehicles near a river crossing. The crews took off one after another, a few minutes apart. Everything went as planned. The first planes dropped their bombs and turned for home. And then, a voice in the radio, sharp and trembling. "Under attack! Fighter!" Then silence. Those still in the air saw it happen. A shadow suddenly emerging from the darkness. Larger, faster than any Po-2. From its wings flashed fiery streaks of tracer fire. And the small wooden plane of their comrades burst into flame. A spark thrown into a bonfire. It didn't fall. It disintegrated, raining fire from the sky. Wood, fabric, fuel, all fused into one blazing torch. They watched it descend, leaving behind a burning scar in the black night. It lasted only seconds, but for those who saw it, that image burned into memory forever. Yet the worst horror was still to come. Not in the sky, but on the ground. The planes returned, one after another, landing on the muddy field. Ground crews rushed to refuel, to rearm, to send them back up again. But one position stayed empty. No movement, no lights. 10 minutes passed. 20. 30. Everyone left on the ground stared westward, toward the dark horizon, straining to hear the faint hum of an engine, hoping, praying. They say soldiers get used to death. That's a lie. You never get used to waiting, to the kind of hope that dies slowly, painfully, with each passing minute. Maybe they landed in a field. Maybe they made it to friendly lines. Maybe dawn brought not just cold dew, but clarity, brutal and final. They weren't coming back. Ever. There were no official funerals in the regiment, only an empty bunk in a dugout. And silence. How can you get used to the empty seat at dinner? To the cold bed beside your own? The regiment formed its own silent ritual. Commander Yevdokia Bershanskaya personally gathered the belongings of the fallen. A few photos, letters from home, a book of poems, an embroidered handkerchief, all carefully folded into a small wooden case. No speeches, no loud weeping. Tears were a luxury they couldn't afford. Their grief was quiet, heavy, palpable, hanging in the air like mist. The surviving friends would take some small keepsake, a flight map, a silk scarf, a simple pencil. And the next night, they would fly again, gripping that tiny fragment of a lost life in their pocket. They flew to avenge. Days later, reconnaissance reported a crash site, a wrecked plane found near a village by the river. Locals had buried 2 young women beneath an old birch tree. From the aircraft, only charred fragments remained, a twisted engine, burned wings. Death had become their constant companion. It slept in the next bunk, sat in the next cockpit. And it changed them forever. This was no longer just a war for their homeland. It had become personal, a vendetta. And the night witches began to repay their debt with interest. Like the banner of the guards, every flight they made became an act of vengeance. The death of their comrades didn't break them, it hardened them. Their grief turned into cold, deliberate fury. There was no longer room for fear or doubt, only work, heavy, bloody night work. They began flying with reckless daring, on the edge of madness. If the target was well defended, they'd make 3, even 4, bombing runs, cutting through walls of flak to drop their payloads dead on target. They hunted specific officers, destroyed command cars, blew up depots with surgical precision. Their style became unmistakable. Accuracy, audacity, inevitability. And that fury became a weapon in itself as the Red Army pushed southward, gnawing into the German defenses in the battle for the Caucasus. Autumn and winter, 1942 to 43. Hell on earth, mud, stone, and fire. In the mountains and foothills, along narrow passes and winding rivers, the fate of the entire southern front was being decided. And in that battle, the night witches played a crucial role. By day, German troops and supply convoys hid in gullies and forests. But when night fell, the sky above them began to hum. A soft, rhythmic drone of dozens of Po-2 engines filled the darkness. The girls hovered over the roads, methodically destroying trucks, fuel tankers, artillery tractors. They turned German logistics into chaos, cutting off reinforcements, choking supply lines. Retreating columns found themselves trapped, pinned by an invisible force. They ruled the night skies of the Caucasus. Their work was ruthless, but vital. And in the Kremlin, at last, people began to take notice of what German soldiers in the trenches had known for months. Do you know what order reached the regiment that winter? February 8th, 1943. Before the assembled regiment, an officer read aloud an order from the People's Commissar of Defense. For courage and heroism in battle, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was awarded the title of Guards. From that moment, they were officially the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. In the Red Army, the title Guards was the highest possible honor, reserved for units that had shown mass heroism and unmatched bravery in the hardest of fights. Guards received better pay, better uniforms, and endless respect. It was triumph, absolute and undisputed. The same young women who had once been mocked as Dunya's regiment were now the elite of the Soviet Air Force. They stood in formation, listening to the order, and they wept. But those were not only tears of joy. They cried for those who hadn't lived to see that day. They knew that every letter in their new title had been written in the blood of their friends. They were guards now, the elite. But to the enemy, they were still the night witches. And the louder their fame grew, the more fiercely they were hunted. It became a personal duel. The news of a women's regiment being granted the Guards title infuriated the German command. It was a slap in the face, an insult. The hunt for the witches intensified. Germany's best night fighter aces were sent against them. Every Luftwaffe pilot dreamed of downing a plane from the legendary Guards Regiment, a guaranteed Iron Cross and eternal glory. For the women themselves, the new title changed nothing in their daily lives. They still lived in dugouts and tents, still trudged through mud in heavy boots, still froze in the cutting wind of the steppe. Their Po-2s hadn't become any stronger or faster. They were still made of wood and fabric, still burned like matches when hit. Death had not gone anywhere. It still flew beside them on every mission. The Guards banner didn't stop bullets. Medals on their uniforms didn't make plywood tougher. They were legends, but still mortal. And soon they would have to prove their Guards' honor on a night when hell itself descended upon their airfield. The night when wings burned. It was another night of tense routine work. Late May, 1943. Fierce battles raged across the Taman Peninsula, where Soviet forces were fighting to break through the German Blue Line, one of the strongest fortified zones on the entire front. The regiment was stretched to its limits. Their airfield near the village of Ivanovskaya buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Planes took off, landed, refueled, and disappeared once more into the black. The conveyor of death never stopped. But high above the dark steppe, unseen and silent, another presence lurked. A German reconnaissance plane circling patiently for hours at high altitude. Its pilot wasn't looking for targets to bomb. He was mapping the airfield, every aircraft stand, every fuel depot, every ammunition dump. And on his map, he drew a thick red cross, a cross upon their home. The strike came after midnight, sudden, merciless. A heavy German bomber swept over the airfield at low altitude. The first wave of bombs hit the storage depots. The ground shuddered beneath a monstrous explosion. A column of fire rose hundreds of meters into the sky. For a few blinding seconds, night turned into a ghastly, hellish day. And in that deadly light, the entire regiment was exposed. Every plane on the ground, fully fueled, bombs already hanging under their wings. Helpless. Then came the incendiaries. In an instant, their home, their only refuge, became a sea of fire. The Po-2s, soaked with gasoline, stood on the field like powder kegs, and the fuse was already lit. What followed was nothing short of slaughter. The percale skin of the planes burst into flames at the slightest spark. The wooden frames blackened and crumbled within seconds. The fire leapt from one aircraft to the next. They burned like straw tossed into a bonfire. Bombs began to detonate beneath the wings. The airfield became an inferno, a rolling sea of fire where fiery mushrooms rose again and again. Anyone else would have run, but not them. Through the chaos, among exploding bombs and burning wrecks, small figures darted across the field. A command shouted above the roar of explosions, "Girls, save the planes!" And they ran into the flames. They dragged surviving aircraft away from the burning ones. They tried to start engines, to taxi them out of the inferno. Navigator Zhenya Rudneva and mechanic Olya Kliuyeva, together, pushed a plane clear of the fire and saved it. Pilots and technicians beat out flames with their bare hands, suffering horrific burns. Their clothes caught fire, their hair burned, but they kept going, fighting to save every plane they called their own. They hauled them from the fire, ignoring pain, ignoring danger. When the sun rose, it revealed devastation. Smoke still curled above the twisted remains of the airfield. It looked like a graveyard. Blackened skeletons of Po-2s stood in their places like burnt monuments. That night, the regiment suffered its worst losses of the entire war. 8 of their comrades were dead, 4 entire crews burned alive in their planes or on the ground. 14 aircraft destroyed, almost half the regiment. The German command celebrated. They thought the legend was finished, the witches annihilated, broken, demoralized. They thought the regiment was done. But the survivors stood there among the ashes, faces blackened with soot, hands burned raw. There were no tears, only cold, ringing hatred. Any other unit would have been withdrawn to the rear for reorganization. Any other, but not them. Not the guards. Do you know what Bershanskaya did that very night? Standing amidst the smoking ruins of her airfield, with only a handful of planes left to her command. Helren, the ones who rose from the ashes. It was madness. A direct violation of every regulation and order. When the front command learned of the regiment's devastation, they were already drafting an order to withdraw what was left of the 46th Guards Regiment to the rear, for rest for reorganization, for safety. Any other unit would have seen that as salvation. But Yevdokia Bershanskaya knew her girls. She gathered the survivors at the edge of the charred runway and gave the order that would enter legend. Guards, prepare every plane still standing. The mission remains the same. They had to show the enemy they could not be broken, that they could not be burned. They had to come back that very night. Imagine the German soldiers that evening, rejoicing. At last, it was over. The nightmare was finished. No more sleepless terror. No more eerie whispers from the sky. They smoked, laughed, celebrated. And then someone raised his head. Do you hear that? In the night air came a sound they knew too well. First one engine, then another, then a third. 5 Po-2s droned overhead. 5 ghosts, risen from the ashes. Panic spread through the German ranks like wildfire. It couldn't be real. They were destroyed. Then the whispers returned. They weren't human. They were witches, real witches, untouched by fire or steel. That night, they brought not so much death as pure terror. They proved that their will could not be consumed by flames. While the regiment rebuilt, the Red Army was preparing for its next great offensive. They weren't sent to the rear. Instead, new planes arrived to replace the burned ones, and with them, new recruits. Young girls, barely 18 or 19. They looked at the veterans with awe and reverence, and the veterans looked back and saw themselves a year earlier. Naive, untested, still unacquainted with real fear. Now, they had to be taught to fight all over again, not the way they'd learned in flight school, but the way you survived here, at the front. Experienced crews took the rookies on missions, teaching them the grim, priceless lessons written in blood. How to slip past searchlights, how to listen to the sky and sense a fighter before it struck, how to trick the anti-aircraft guns. The regiment had risen from the ashes, stronger, sharper, angrier. Their path led them westward, to Crimea, to Belarus, to places where the enemy fought like a cornered beast. Are you ready to see how they took back their homeland? By spring 1944, they were over Sevastopol. The Germans, trapped against the sea, tried to evacuate by boat. The witches turned the evacuation into hell, bombing the piers, the barges, the transports through the black nights. By summer, Operation Bagration, the liberation of Belarus. They took part in the legendary Rail War, hovering above railway junctions, cutting enemy reinforcements from the front. Their fame spread across the entire Soviet Union. 23 of the regiment's women would receive the title Hero of the Soviet Union, more than any other air regiment in history. They crossed the border, into Poland. The land was foreign, the sky unfamiliar. And the closer they came to the enemy's lair, the fiercer his resistance became. German anti-aircraft defenses around major cities were the most advanced in the world. Radar-guided flak, squadrons of night fighters, walls of fire in the air. The witches pressed on, thousands of kilometers flown, tens of thousands of missions completed. Many friends were lost. The end of the war was close enough to touch. But the last step is always the hardest. And the skies over Germany were preparing to test them as they had never been tested before. Ask the sky in flames. The year was 1945. The regiment crossed into Germany. Here the sky was different, heavy, dense, saturated with metal. In the Caucasus or in Belarus, they had hunted isolated searchlights and scattered anti-aircraft guns. But here, something else awaited them. Vast fields of light covered every city, every bridge, every factory. Hundreds of coordinated beams turned the night into blazing day. while hundreds of radar-guided cannons built walls of fire across the heavens. The pilots had a name for it: barrage fire. When you don't fly between the explosions, you fly through them. Every mission over Germany was a round of Russian roulette. Flak tore through the fragile percale skin of their planes, slicing it with molten shrapnel. But a new fear took hold, deeper and crueler than all the rest: the fear of not living to see victory. That thought haunted them every night. It was one thing to die in 1942, when the enemy stood at the Volga and your death still meant defense. It was another thing entirely to burn in the sky in April of 1945, when the end was already visible, weeks, maybe days, away. The exhaustion was crushing. Almost 3 years of night missions. 3 years of living on adrenaline, without real sleep or rest. Their nerves were drawn tight as wire. And still they flew. One thought, one sacred word drove them forward: Berlin. They had to see the burning city with their own eyes. Can you imagine what they felt? Looking down on the streets of the fallen Reich? And April 1945. The battle for Berlin began. The 46th Guards Regiment operated on the outskirts of the city. Their mission was unchanged: deny the enemy rest, destroy strong points, support the advancing ground forces. But now, everything was different. Beneath the slow wings of their Po-2s lay the ruins of the 1,000-year Reich. They saw the red glow of fires lighting the city, heard through their headsets the endless thunder of artillery grinding the last fragments of resistance to dust. It was the moment of ultimate triumph. They, the girls who had once been told the army had no place for women, now flew their wooden bedsteads over the capital of the enemy. Each bomb that fell on Berlin's suburbs was a personal salute to the memory of their fallen friends. They completed their duty to the very end. The regiment's final combat sortie took place on the 4th of May, 1945, above Berlin. And a few days later, the war was over. What happens to a soldier when the guns finally fall silent? The news of Germany's surrender reached them at an airfield near Berlin. There were no cheers, no gunfire in celebration, only silence. Staggering, unfamiliar, almost painful silence. Then came the realization: it was over. No more missions tonight, or tomorrow, or ever again. Many sat on their bunks, staring into nothing. The tension of 3 long years drained away, and in its place came a weight they had never known, a deep, all-consuming fatigue. They had done it. They had won. They had survived. Some simply lay down and slept. And they slept for an entire day, unmoving. For the first time in 3 years, they slept the sleep of peace, a sleep no alarm, no explosion could break. The war was over. But their stories, their private wars, were only beginning. They were victors. They were heroes. They were legends. And yet, war leaves scars invisible to outsiders. What became of the night witches when they took off their helmets and returned to the very world for which they had fought so fiercely? At Airfield, the last flight. They went home, carrying medals, faded uniforms, and memories too heavy to name. In October of 1945, the 46th Guards Taman Red Banner Order of Suvorov Night Bomber Regiment was disbanded. The legend ended. Life began. They believed the worst war was over. They were wrong. Ahead waited another battle. Silent, invisible, and in many ways just as cruel. A war against their own memories. The world they returned to was different. And they were different too. Barely in their 20s. Yet their eyes held the weight of old men. They couldn't sleep in silence. They flinched at sudden noises. They dreamed of falling planes, of the faces of lost friends, of blinding searchlights. Society welcomed them with flowers and speeches, but not always with understanding. A male veteran was familiar, but a young woman, covered in medals. That was strange, unsettling. People asked foolish questions. Some didn't believe them. They'd smile and say, "Weren't you afraid?" As if anyone could fly into death for 3 years and not be afraid. Many of them never told their children or grandchildren what they had truly seen. They hid their war deep inside. But that doesn't mean they gave up. Do you know who these witches became in peacetime? They went back to school, those who had left straight from the classroom or the first year of university. They earned degrees. They became engineers, doctors, teachers, historians. They married. They raised children. They built, they taught, they healed. They rebuilt the country for which they had fought. And once a year, on the 2nd of May, they gathered in Moscow, near the Bolshoi Theater. Gray-haired women, embracing and crying quietly. In those moments, they were again the girls of the 46th Guards Regiment, the only ones who could ever truly understand one another. They built new lives upon the ruins of the old. They proved they could be not only fearless warriors, but creators. That was their true legacy. This was the story of how ordinary girls became soldiers, how a plywood training plane became a weapon of terror, how a mocking name, Dunya's Regiment, became the legend whispered with fear, Nachthexen, the Night Witches. They flew more than 24,000 combat missions. Each survivor had nearly 1,000 night sorties to her name, numbers that sound impossible. But behind those numbers, unimaginable labor, exhaustion, blood, and loss. Their story isn't about superhumans. It's about the strength of the human spirit, stronger than steel, stronger than fear. Their planes have long turned to dust. Their names fade with time. But as long as we remember them, their last flight is not over. So, if you want to hear the stories of those who dared to look into the abyss, subscribe to the channel. Because the darkest nights give birth to the brightest stars.